decided with the organization because at the end of my provisional work, the title is Referendum and Constitutional Revision between Democratic and Guaranteeing Instances in Modern Democracies. And the aim of my presentation is to find some indicators that made us able to distinguish between plebiscite and referendum in constitutional process of changement of the constitution. This is my focus. The democratic instances that characterize modern constitutional systems would lead to a favorable attitude towards the instruments of direct democracy, obviously. Conversely, the liberal demands that must continue to characterize contemporary legal system lead instead to pay some attention to some tools of direct democracy, because they are often subject to manipulation in a plebiscitary sense. Democratic principle in one side and guarantee of the rights of minorities on the other must therefore be balanced in the use of these kind of instruments of direct democracy in constitutional processes. Indeed, it is certainly true that recourse to referendum can often perform functions of popular involvement of citizens in political decisions. However, it is equally well known that the referendum can be used in the opposite sense, with the aim of giving a surplus of democratic legitimacy to a decision which is in truth taken from above. In these cases, the referendum plays a function of legitimizing the holders of power and not an effective function of involving citizens in the process. This approach must also be kept with reference to the possible presence of forms of referendum in the processes of constitutional reform. From this point of view, it is clear that the constitutional revision processes can certainly benefit from direct popular involvement, precisely because they affect the constitutional matter in which popular involvement is particularly relevant. At the same time, since the constitutions should be the expression of a broad consensus, the reasons for the protection of minorities are even greater in constitutional matters. In order to identify the cases in which the introduction of institutes of direct democracy in the constitutional revision process responds to an authentic democratic request or has a plebiscitary purpose, it is useful to identify some indicators of a structural and formal nature that allow us to distinguish when a legal system provides for the use of the referendum within the constitutional revision process as a tool of effective citizen involvement, or, on the contrary, as a plebiscitary mechanism with the real purpose of legitimizing a political decision taken by the holders of power. In this slide, I propose to use these possible formal indicators. The first indicators we have to look at in order to make this distinction is the placement of the referendum at the beginning or at the end of the review process. The referendum is sometimes placed downstream of the constitutional reform process after an articulated process in Parliament. In this case, the constitutional structure of the revision process seems to minimize the plebiscitary risks. the popular vote takes place after a pluralist dialect in parliament and in the society. On the other hand, when the procedure provides for an early referendum, it's easier to determine a poorly thought popular decision. In this case, it is very likely the people's pronouncement be ambiguous since the lack of a real pluralistic information. Therefore, in this case, the mere political position of the electorate can prevail on the merit of the constitutional matter. The second indicator I propose is if the referendum is mandatory or eventual in its nature. The referendum can be mandatory in the sense that it is necessary in order to proceed with the constitutional reform, or it can be upon request, or at least it can be held only if some circumstances occur. Basically, I would say that a constitutional structure that minimizes the plebiscitary risks of the reform procedure will have to provide for a referendum upon request, and not always necessary in all cases. In fact, the referendum usually imposes a majority decision, while the constitutions should be supported by a larger than a simple majority. Thus, constitutions which provide that the referendum is used only if a sufficiently broad consensus has not been reached in the legislative assemblies, for example, or only if there is a request from the minority at least, will be less exposed to plebiscitary distortions. Third indicator I propose is the origin of the referendum request. The most important indicator to be evaluated is that relating to the origin of the referendum request. When the referendum is convened from above, it is from the top of the executive, for example, or from the parliamentary majority, the constitution is using a scheme clearly aimed at favoring the current holders of the power rather than that of popular involvement. Fourth, the extension of the object of the referendum request. When the object of the referendum is a unitary provision or a set of provisions which as a whole have a unitary or univocal meaning, the referendum will be able more easily to perform an authentically democratic function. Only when the content is clear and homogeneous, in fact, can voters be effectively informed on the subject. Only in this case can they be effectively free, and they can be freely expressed, will be able to freely express themselves. When the referendum can concern a reform with heterogeneous content instead, it will be easier. It takes on the features of a plebiscite. Because the content will not be clear, and the voter could be in favor of only one part of the reform and not the other, but they have to express a single vote. Fifth, which is, I think, the most contentious indicator I propose, is the presence of a validity quorum in the process. Certainly, to dilute the majority nature of the referendum, it could be useful to provide that the constitutional referendum is valid only if it has achieved a participation of more than 50% of those entitled. Obviously, the guarantor function of the quorum, therefore, would exist only if it were envisaged as a burden on the approval of the referendum and not as a burden on those who are against it, as the minority. These are the 5 indicators I think can be useful to distinguish between referendum as a true mechanism to express the real will of the people and to make them involved in the process, and not to have a plebiscite, which is a form of vesting the decision of the power holders with the authority of the people, which is manipulating in a formally not well organized process. It seems to me that these 5 indicators can be useful in order to this end, which means to evaluate the plebiscitary structure or not of the provision of the referendum within the procedures that a constitution establishes for the constitutional revision. Nevertheless, they are not sufficient in the evaluation of the real political institutional practice. In the Italian case, for example, the structure of the constitutional revision process seems to envisage a rather guaranteeing use of the referendum according to these indicators. In Italian constitution, the referendum is downstream of a complex parliamentary procedure. It's optional. It is at the request of the minority, although its object may not be sufficiently circumscribed, or nor is a quorum is required. Nevertheless, in the last 2 cases of Italian constitutional referendums, the majorities in office have tried to make a plebiscitary use of it. In fact, the Italian constitution provides for that the referendum can be requested by a minority. Indeed, the referendum is celebrated upon the request of 1/5 of the parliamentarians or by 500,000 people of citizens. But since the majority itself can command 1/5 of the MPs, obviously, and in any case can mobilize 500,000 voters, it can happen, and it happened in 2005 and 2016 referendums, that it was the majority itself that asked for a vote on its proposal for revision in a plebiscite function. Furthermore, these were 2 major reforms of a very inhomogeneous content. The plebiscitary attempt exploiting holes in the constitutional procedure was clear, even if in truth it backfired against the majority, because both referendums rejected the reforms proposed by the majorities because the people didn't want them. On a comparative level, this research obviously needs to be implemented. To date, as you can see, it is still nothing more than a working hypothesis, however, can be immediately made. An example can be immediately made. It's the Brexit referendum, which is quite famous, of course. It can be considered, according to the indicator I proposed, essentially, it can be considered essentially constitutional in nature, as far as this feature can be adapted to the UK legal system endowed with a flexible constitution. It had a clearly plebiscitary structure, according to the indicators proposed. Its positioning has been anticipated with respect to the parliamentary procedure. It is not at the request of the minority, but foreseen by a bill enacted by the majority of British Parliament. It had a substantially vague object, so that the meaning of its outcome has been the subject of diversified subsequent parliamentary interpretations. There was no provision for a qualified majority or a quorum for its validity. However, it is difficult to say that it was a plebiscitary use of the referendum, since it was not a question of giving democratic legitimacy to a decision already taken by the British government. Indeed, it was precisely the difficulty in deciding by the choice in power in that period and now as well, that produced this initiative. Furthermore, the outcome of the referendum is certainly not a plebiscitary one, which turned out to be contrary to what the current Prime Minister Cameron expected at the time. In conclusion, provisionally, it can be said that these 5 structure indicators can actually be useful for assessing whether the different constitutional revision procedures have correctly balanced elements which confer a surplus of democratic legitimacy to the constitutional revision processes with guarantee type objectives to protect minorities and rights, which in a liberal system must also be guaranteed against even majorities expressed in a referendum. However, these juridical indicators are not sufficient and must be enriched by evaluation however, these juridical indicators are not sufficient and must be enriched by evaluations of the more complex political, institutional, and constitutional system. Indeed, even when the guarantees of the procedure are strong, there can be instrumental uses of the referendum institute. Conversely, even where the procedural guarantees are weak, if the legal system has a strong democratic and liberal history, the plebiscitary use of these instruments seems mostly equally excluded. Thank you.